The wind in the central highlands of Peru does not blow but cuts. It is an invisible blade made of ice and altitude that sweeps the plains of Huánuco with a ferocity capable of breaking the least prepared men. There, where the air is so scarce that each breath is a conscious effort, and the sky seems so close that it could be touched with the fingertips, a civilization rose that defied not only nature, but time itself. Between the years 1200 and 1480 after Christ, long before the hosts of the Inca Empire set their greedy eyes on these lands, the Yarowilca had already engraved their name in the eternal stone of the Andes. They were not simply mountain dwellers, they were its guardians, its architects, and its absolute lords. The history of the YAROS does not begin with a bloody conquest, but with a silent and monumental affirmation of existence. In a world where survival was a daily struggle against the piercing cold and the elusive earth, they chose not only to survive, but to dominate. Their legacy is not written in parchments that disintegrate with humidity, but in stone walls that still rise today towards the clouds, mute witnesses of a greatness that refused to be forgotten. The very name of this people encloses the duality of their spirit, a living paradox that defined every aspect of their culture. Yarowilca. The word decomposes into two ancient roots that resonate like a war drum in the collective memory. Yaro, which means rebel man, nonconformist, the one who refuses to accept the yoke imposed by others. Wilca, which refers to the sacred plant, the divine. What connects the earthly world with the spiritual? They were, by definition, the sacred rebels. An ethnicity that understood that freedom was not a gift from the gods, but a human construction made with sweat, blood, and stone. This identity was not a geographical accident, but a conscious choice. While other cultures in the warmer valleys dedicated themselves to peaceful commerce or static ritual, the Yaros looked towards the summits and saw fortresses. They looked towards the horizon and saw potential enemies. Their society was structured like a war machine disguised as an agricultural community. Every man was a potential soldier, every woman a guardian of provision, every child learned before walking what was the sound of the wind when it brings danger and what when it brings peace. The most visible manifestation of their power, and the one that still today leaves breathless those who venture into the ruins of Tantamayo and Rapayán, was their architecture. They did not build simple dwellings to shelter from the rain. They built pre-Inca skyscrapers, stone buildings of up to 5 stories high that drove into the ground like inverted spears defying gravity. Imagine the scene 700 years ago, the morning sun striking the polished stone facades, illuminating trapezoidal windows that served both for ventilation and for defense. They did not have iron tools, nor robust beasts of burden like horses, nor complex pulleys. They only had human hands, chisels of harder stone, and an iron will. Each block was cut, transported, and assembled with a precision that would make modern engineers blush. The towers of Tantamayo were not just dwellings, they were watchtowers. From their upper floors, the Yaro sentinels could see the movement of any enemy army kilometers away. They could see the dust raised by the sandals of the invaders long before the first war cry broke the silence of the Puna. The construction of these citadels, like Garu, Mazur, and Huánuco, required a complex and hierarchical social organization. It was not the work of slaves subdued by the whip, but the work of a community united by a common purpose of permanence. The Yaro architects understood the seismology of the region intuitively. Their walls leaned slightly inward to resist the earthquakes that shake the Andes. Their foundations sank deeply into the bedrock to prevent sliding. When a visitor arrived at the Yaro capital, he did not see a disordered conglomerate of huts. He saw a planned city with cobblestone streets, drainage systems for torrential rains and ceremonial plazas where the smoke of sacrifice rose towards the Apu, the sacred mountain that watched everything with eyes of eternal snow. This constructive capacity was so advanced, so superior to that of its neighbors, that it became its first line of defense. How to besiege a city that seems to grow from the mountain itself? How to scale walls that are lost in the mist? The economy of the Yarowilca was the fuel that allowed this monumental machinery. On the agricultural terraces that scaled the hillsides, they cultivated life itself. Potato, corn, beans, quinoa. Each furrow was a trench against hunger. They domesticated South American camelids, llamas, and alpacas, which not only provided wool to dress the relentless cold, but served as cargo transport on the vertical paths of the highlands. But do not be mistaken, the relative abundance of the Yaros did not make them peaceful. On the contrary, wealth attracts wolves, and in the Andes, wolves have human form and carry bronze axes. The Yaros were shepherds, yes, but they were armed shepherds. Their daily life was constant training. The man who grazed his flock in the morning and the afternoon practiced with the sling, the lethal weapon that could break a skull at 100 paces distance. The woman who wove the wool also knew how to prepare war provisions, the charqui and chuño that would allow the warriors to resist months of siege without depending on vulnerable supply lines. Yarowilca society was organized in a confederation of ethnic groups, a network of loyalties that wove a solid regional empire before the arrival of the Tahuantinsuyo. There was no single divine emperor, as there would be later in Cusco, but a warrior nobility that governed through consensus and demonstrated force. The cuartas, the local leaders, met in councils under the shadows of the Rapayán towers to decide the fate of their people. It was a democracy of swords, where authority was earned in the defense of the territory and lost in cowardice. This political structure made them resilient. If one leader fell, another rose. If one fortress fell, the resistance moved to the next. There was no single head to cut to decapitate the nation. They were a stone hydra in the heights of Pasco and the upper Marañón. This apparent fragmentation was, in reality, their greatest strategic strength. The invaders who sought a decisive battle only found shadows and empty stones, while the Yaro warriors watched them from the summits, waiting for the exact moment to strike. But time is a river that does not stop, and in the south, far from the mists of Huánuco, a new force was awakening. The Incas from their sacred valley had begun their relentless expansion. Under the leadership of visionary rulers like Pachacutec, the Tahuantinsuyo grew like a fire that consumed everything in its path. The armies of the sun advanced towards the north, subduing kingdoms, absorbing cultures, imposing Quechua and the cult of Inti. For the Incas, the world had an order, and that order demanded that all peoples kneel before the Sapa Inca. Resistance was considered chaos that had to be corrected, an anomaly that had to be eliminated. When the Inca explorers, the Chasqui and spies dressed as merchants, arrived at the limits of the Yarowilca territory, what they saw left them frozen, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of the challenge. They did not encounter dispersed tribes. They encountered an organized, fortified, and hostile state. The reports that arrived in Cusco described towers that touched the sky and warriors who knew every inch of terrain infernal for any foreign army. The Inca generals, accustomed to rapid victory and negotiated surrender of the valley peoples, immediately understood that the Yaros were different. They were not like the Chimu, who could be subdued by cutting their water channels. They were not like the Chancas, who could be massacred in open field. The Yaros lived in the fortress itself. Their water came from springs protected inside the citadels. Their food was stored in inaccessible stone silos. Attacking the Yarowilca would not be a military campaign, It would be a war of attrition against geography itself. However, the Inca Empire did not stop before obstacles. The expansionist ideology required that these lands, rich in resources and strategically located on the way to the jungle and the north coast, be incorporated. The order arrived from the Coricancha. The YAROS had to be subdued, pacified, or destroyed. The news of the Inca approach spread through the Yarowilca communities like a trail of gunpowder. There was no panic, there was preparation. The llama leather drums began to sound in the nights, transmitting messages from mountain to mountain. The curacas convened the warriors to the weapon plazas of Garu and Tantamayo. The copper spears were sharpened, the slings were reviewed, more stones were stored on the walls. The YAROS knew what the arrival of the Inca meant. It meant the end of their autonomy, the end of their local gods, the end of their way of living. It meant becoming mitimes, pieces moved on an imperial chessboard far from their homes. And the Yaro spirit, that rebel and nonconformist spirit that carried in its name, refused to accept that destiny. The decision was unanimous in the war councils. They would resist, no matter the cost, no matter the size of the enemy army. The stone towers would be their tombs if necessary, but they would not be their cages. The first encounters were not camp battles, but ghostly skirmishes. The Inca armies, vast and colorful, advanced through the lower valleys, seeking a weak point in the Yarowilca defense. But the YAROS did not go down to fight on terrain that favored Inca heavy infantry. They waited in the heights. When the Inca columns ventured into the narrow passes of the Puna, where the air is thin and movement is slow, the YAROS attacked. From the invisible crests, rains of stones fell propelled by expert slings. Yaro warriors, agile as mountain goats, descended paths that the Incas could not even see, struck the rear of the enemy troops and disappeared before a counter-offensive could be organized. It was a war of psychological attrition. The Inca soldiers, accustomed to the discipline of closed formation, felt helpless against an enemy that seemed to be part of the landscape. The cold of the night, combined with the constant fear of ambush, began to take a high price on the morale of the invading army. The Inca generals were forced to stop the advance. They camped on the slopes of the mountains, looking up towards the dark silhouettes of the Yaro fortresses outlined against the moon. They knew they had the numbers in their favor. They knew they had the resources of the largest empire that America had ever seen, but they also knew they could lose thousands of men trying to take each of those stone towers. The terrain was the most formidable ally of the YAROS. Every attempt at frontal assault resulted in a carnage for the attackers. The ladders broke under the weight of the Inca warriors climbing steep slopes. The battering rams were useless against walls built to resist centuries. The YAROS, from their elevated positions, poured boiling water and launched projectiles with deadly precision. The Battle of the Heights was not a single event, but a constant series of violent clashes where the YAROS demonstrated that their knowledge of the cold and difficult terrain was a weapon more lethal than any bronze sword. However, the reality of war is that resources are not infinite, not even for the Yarowilca. The Incas could afford the luxury of replacing their casualties. They could call more reinforcements from Cusco, from Quito, from any corner of their domain. The YAROS were a finite population. Every warrior who fell in the defense of the towers was a father, a brother, a builder who could not be easily replaced. The pressure of the siege began to be felt. The provisions, although abundant, had a limit. Winter was approaching, and with it the snow that would close the passes and further isolate the fortresses. The Yaro leaders met again in the stone rooms of their citadels. The fire of the torches projected long shadows on the wind-cured faces of the Caracas. The discussion was tense. Some advocated fighting to the last man, turning the towers into monuments to death rather than submission. Others, more pragmatic, saw the inevitability of Inca power. It was not a question of valor, it was a question of long-term cultural survival. Meanwhile, in the Inca camp, the strategy was also evolving. The commanders of the Sapa Inca had received new instructions. The total destruction of the YAROS was possible, but costly. And the empire needed stability, not cemeteries full of rebels that could inspire future revolts in other provinces. The Incas were masters of diplomacy as much as of war. They understood the value of co-optation. If they could have the YAROS as allies, they would have the best warriors of the central highlands serving the empire. If they destroyed them, they would only have smoking ruins. The news of the warrior reputation of the YAROS had even reached the ears of the emperor. It was said that a Yaro could resist the cold that would kill a common man in one night. It was said that their architects could build bridges and temples that would last forever. This information changed the strategic calculation. The sword could conquer the body, but only respect could conquer the soul of a people like the YAROS. The first peace probes were then initiated. They were not unconditional surrenders, but invitations to dialogue. Inca ambassadors, selected for their eloquence and knowledge of local customs, approached the Yaro defensive lines under truce flags. They brought gifts, fine alpaca textiles, gold vessels, coca from the best valley plantations. They were not bribes, they were signs of respect. They recognized the nobility of the enemy. The Yaro leaders, cautious, agreed to listen. The meetings took place on neutral lands, between the mists of the Puna, where the wind carried the words from one side to the other. The Incas offered something unexpected, not the destruction of the Yaro identity, but its privileged integration. The Caracas would maintain their titles, the local gods would be tolerated alongside Inti, the lands would continue to be worked by their original owners. In exchange, they only had to recognize the sovereignty of the Sapa Inca and provide warriors for the imperial campaigns. It was an offer that preserved Yaro pride while accepting the political reality of the new world order. The decision was not immediate. Distrust was deep, cemented in weeks of blood spilled on the mountain slopes. The youngest warriors wanted to continue the fight. They felt that negotiating was betraying those fallen in the Battle of the Heights. But the elders, those who remembered the sagas of past generations, saw further. They saw that total resistance would lead to extermination, while strategic alliance could ensure the survival of their lineage. The meaning of Yaro, the rebel, could transform. They would no longer be rebels against the order, but guardians within the order. Their non-conformism would be channeled towards excellence within the empire. Finally, after days of deliberation under the cold stars of Huánuco, the main Caracas gave their consent. It was not a humiliating surrender. It was a pact between powers. The YAROS would descend from their towers not as prisoners, but as junior partners in the largest empire of the Andes. This agreement would mark the end of the absolute political independence of the Yarowilca, but the beginning of a new era of influence. The towers of Tantamayo would cease to be war fortresses to become imperial administrative centers. The Yaro architects, those who had designed the stone skyscrapers, would be requisitioned by the Inca. It is said that many of the builders who worked on the great works of Cusco and on the roads of the Capacñan carried Yaro blood in their veins and Yaro knowledge in their hands. Yarowilca construction technology merged with Inca engineering, creating even more impressive structures. The culture did not die, it metamorphosed. Traditional dances, like the Mama Raiguana, survived the regime change, adapting to celebrate both the local ancestors and the new order. The armed resistance had ended, but the struggle for identity continued in the fields of culture and administration. However, peace is fragile when built on recent battlefields. Although the pact had been sealed, there were factions within the Yaro ethnic groups, such as the Yaka and the Chupachos, who viewed the new alliance with suspicion. The fragmentation that had previously protected them now threatened to weaken their unified position before the centralizing power of Cusco. The Incas, for their part, maintained garrisons at strategic points, not only to defend the region from outsiders, but to ensure the loyalty of their new allies. It was a delicate balance, a constant dance between local autonomy and imperial authority. The Yaro Caracas had to navigate this political terrain with the same skill with which their ancestors had navigated the mountain slopes. One wrong step could mean the loss of privileges gained with so much blood. The economy of the region transformed under imperial administration. The agricultural surpluses that were previously stored for local war now flowed towards the imperial tambos to feed the armies marching towards other frontiers. The YAROS became key suppliers of food and textiles for the Tahuantinsuyo. Their reputation as tireless workers and expert builders made them valuable. But the most significant change was in the military sphere. The Yaro warriors, those who had made the Inca army bleed in the heights, now wore the uniforms of the empire. They were deployed in distant campaigns, carrying the fame of their ferocity to distant corners of the continent. Their loyalty, once earned, was fierce. The Incas had learned that it was better to have the Yaros fighting in their favor than against them. This transformation from mortal enemies to loyal allies is one of the most fascinating chapters of pre-Columbian history, demonstrating that conquest is not always a matter of destruction, but sometimes of strategic absorption. While the sun set over the ruins of Garu, illuminating the walls that had resisted the siege, a new generation of Yaro children began to grow. They did not know the War of Independence against the Inca, but they inherited the pride of their grandparents. They learned that their ancestors had built towers that touched the sky, and that had forced the largest empire on earth to negotiate instead of destroy. That memory, transmitted orally along with weaving and agriculture techniques, kept the essence of the Yarowilca alive. The stone remained, cold and impassive, witness of the transition. The wind continued cutting in the puna, but it no longer carried the sound of war slings, but the rumor of the steps of mixed armies marching under the banner of the sun. The history of the Yaros had entered a new phase, one where survival depended on political intelligence as much as on the strength of arms. And although their regional empire had disappeared, their legacy was assured in the stone, in the blood of their descendants, and in the history itself of the Andes. The first part of their epic had ended with a pact, but the consequences of that pact would resonate for centuries, preparing the stage for the emergence of figures that would carry their blood and their rebel spirit to the confines of historical knowledge. The silence that followed the pact was not the silence of peace, but the silence of contained tension, like the still air before a snowstorm on the high summits of Huánuco. The towers of Tantamayo, which for generations had looked towards the horizon seeking enemy armies, now turned their trapezoidal windows towards the interior of the empire, watching the stability of an agreement that had transformed the destiny of an entire people. The Yaro Curatas, those men who had sworn loyalty to the Sapa Inca under the icy wind of the Puna, quickly understood that their survival depended on an impeccable execution of their new roles. They were no longer the absolute owners of the mountain, but they had become the privileged guardians of the imperial frontier. This transition was not smooth nor exempt from pain. There were nights in which the elders cried in secret towards the stars, mourning the lost independence, but there were also mornings in which the young looked towards Cusco with ambition, seeing in the empire of the sun a ladder towards a greatness that their ancestors had never imagined. The stone of Garu and Rapayán remained the same, cold and impassive, but the meaning of its walls had changed forever. The Yaro architects were the first to feel the weight and honor of this new era. Fulfilling what was agreed, the master builders of the central highlands were requisitioned by the imperial engineers. Imagine the departure of these men from their homes in Yarowilca. They did not march as chained prisoners, but as valued specialists, carrying their stone and bronze tools, their fiber plumb lines, and their ancestral knowledge about how to tame Andean seismology. The journey towards Cusco was a pilgrimage towards the navel of the world. They crossed hanging fiber bridges that swayed over vertiginous abysses, walked on the Capac Ñan, the network of roads that wove the empire like a gigantic spiderweb. When they arrived at the imperial capital, they encountered a city that was already a wonder of the world, but they saw opportunities for improvement. The Inca builders admired the verticality of the Yaro towers, that capacity to build towards the sky that in Cusco was less common due to the horizontal density of the city. A silent but profound exchange of knowledge then occurred. The Yaros taught the Incas how to elevate their structures without compromising stability, how to use the inclinations of the walls to resist the earthquakes that shook the Andes. In exchange, they learned the imperial aesthetic, the perfect polishing of the stone that fit without mortar. From this fusion were born hybrid works, buildings in the northern provinces that carried the invisible signature of the YAROS, solid as mountains, high as watchtowers, eternal as the stone itself. While the architects built the physical legacy of the empire, the Yaro warriors built their legacy of blood on distant frontiers. The pact had established that the Yaros would provide elite troops for the campaigns of the Sapa Inca, and the Yaros did nothing by halves. If they had been formidable defending their own lands, they were terrifying fighting for those of the Inca. They were deployed in expansion campaigns towards the south, in the arid valleys of what today is Chile, and towards the north, in the cloud forests of Ecuador. In these strange lands, under burning suns or tropical rains that they did not know in their cold highlands, the Yaros maintained their iron discipline. The Inca generals learned to trust the Yaro battalions for the most difficult missions. When an enemy fortress seemed impregnable, when terrain was too hostile for regular troops, the sons of Huánuco were called. Their reputation grew until it became legend within the imperial army itself. It was said that a Yaro soldier could walk 3 days without eating, sleep on snow without freezing, and fight with the fury of a cornered puma. This fame granted them special status. They were not simple subjects, they were allies of honor. They could wear distinctive adornments on their uniforms, specific feathers that signaled their rebel lineage converted into armored loyalty. However, the deepest integration, the one that would ensure the survival of Yaro culture beyond the fall of the empire, occurred in the chambers of the nobility. The Inca, intelligent and visionary, understood that blood unites stronger than treaties. To definitively seal the alliance with the Yaro curacas, marriages were promoted between the local nobility and the Inca princesses, the Ñustas. It was in this crucible of strategic unions where the lineage that history would remember as the Guaman Poma was born. A Yaro noble, direct descendant of those curacas who had negotiated with the Inca in the mists of the Puna, took as wife a woman of Inca royal blood. From this union, not only a child was born, a bridge between two worlds was born. This lineage carried in its veins the non-conformist rebellion of the Yaro and the divine authority of the Inca. They grew up speaking fluent Quechua, but remembering the local sagas in their ancestral language. They learned to read the imperial quipus, but also to interpret the signals of the sacred mountains of Huánuco. This elite mestiçage was crucial. While the empire expanded, they administered the lands of their ancestors with an efficiency that pleased Cusco and protected their local people from the abuses of less scrupulous imperial officials. They were the perfect intermediaries, the guardians of tradition in a world of accelerated changes. Life in the Yarowilca provinces under Inca dominion experienced significant cultural transformation. Traditional dances, such as the Mama Raiguana and the Papa Ale, were not prohibited but adapted. The priests of the sun allowed these rituals to continue as long as a secondary veneration to Inti was incorporated. Thus, in the plazas of Garu, under the shadow of the stone skyscrapers, the peasants danced to the rhythm of the drums, celebrating the harvest of the potato and corn, but now also offering the first spikes to the sun. It was a pragmatic syncretism. The common people, the llama shepherds who lived on the highest slopes, barely noticed the change in their gods, but they did notice the improvement in their roads and security on their frontiers. Trade now flowed without restrictions towards the coast and towards the jungle. The coca from the warm valleys arrived at the heights of Pasco, and the wool of the Yaro alpacas went down to dress the nobles of Cusco. The subsistence economy had become part of a continental economic machinery, but under this apparent prosperity, the Yaro identity remained latent. At nights around the fire, the grandparents told the grandchildren stories of when the towers were war fortresses, of when the Yaros had made the Inca army bleed before signing peace. Those stories were not treason, they were memory. They were the reminder that their loyalty had been chosen, not imposed by total defeat. But no empire is eternal, and the sun of the Tahuantinsuyo began to darken towards the end of the 15th century. The death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac triggered a devastating civil war between his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa. For the Yaros, this was the moment of the definitive test. Which side would they take? Would they maintain their loyalty to the imperial state or take advantage of the chaos to recover their independence? The messengers arrived in Huánuco from both sides, requesting troops, demanding support. The Curatzas of the Guaman lineage met in the stone rooms of Tumanhuari. The debate was intense. Some argued that it was the moment to break the chains, to close the mountain passes and let the Incas destroy each other. Others, more pragmatic, remembered that the stability of the empire was what protected their people from external invasions. Finally, loyalty to the institutional state represented by Huáscar in Cusco prevailed, although many Yaro warriors in the north ended up serving under the command of Atahualpa's generals due to geographical proximity. This division was painful. Brothers fought against brothers on the plains of Ambato and in the valleys of Quito. Yaro blood was spilled in a war that was not theirs, weakening their own demographic structure. However, their reputation as implacable warriors remained intact. Both sides feared and respected the battalions of Huánuco, knowing that their presence on the battlefield could tip the balance of any confrontation. While the civil war tore the entrails of the empire, a much stranger and more terrible threat was approaching from the sea. Bearded men, dressed in shining metal, riding unknown beasts that spat fire and thunder, had arrived on the northern coasts. At first, the reports that arrived at the central highlands sounded like myths, like legends of returning gods. But when the news became concrete, when it was known that the Inca Atahualpa had been captured in Cajamarca, reality imposed itself with the force of a huaico. The empire staggered. The road system that the Yaros had helped maintain now served for the invaders to advance rapidly towards the heart of the Andes. For the Yaros, the arrival of the Spaniards represented an existential dilemma, even greater than the arrival of the Incas. The Incas had been understandable enemies, humans, with gods that, although different, inhabited the same mountains and shared the same respect for the earth. The Spaniards were a total unknown. Their technology was overwhelming, their religion intolerant, their ambition apparently infinite. The Yarowilca watched from their towers as the known world crumbled. Columns of smoke rose in the valleys where there was once peace. The imperial tambos were looted. The cosmic order had broken. In the midst of this collapse, the Guaman lineage began to weave its survival strategy. They understood that armed resistance direct against the Spaniards was suicidal. They had seen them fight. They had seen the power of their arquebuses and horses. They remembered the lesson that their ancestors learned with the Incas. Sometimes, survival requires negotiation and adaptation. However, unlike the negotiation with the Incas, which was between military powers, this would be a negotiation for cultural preservation. The Yarowilca descendants began to serve as intermediaries between the Spaniards and the indigenous populations. They used their literacy, their knowledge of local customs and their noble status to protect their communities from the excesses of the encomenderos. But there was a member of this lineage who would take resistance to a different level, an intellectual level that would endure centuries. Felipe Guaman de Ayala, born decades after the conquest, would be the final voice of this people. In his old age, he would travel the dusty roads of the viceroyalty, collecting testimonies drawing the memory of his people. The work of Guaman was not just a chronicle, it was an act of monumental resistance. In his pages, he captured the history of the Yaros, their architecture, their customs, their justice. He drew the towers of Tantamayo as he had heard them described by his grandparents, imposing 5 stories, defying the sky. He wrote about the sacred rebellion, about the meaning of Yaro and Wilca. Through his pen, the culture that had been absorbed by the Inca Empire and then subjugated by the Spanish Empire found an eternal voice. Guaman understood that stones could be destroyed, that temples could be burned, but that the written word, the memory preserved on paper, was immune to fire. His manuscript, sent to the King of Spain, was a denunciation of colonial abuses, but also a proud affirmation of his heritage. In his drawings, he represented himself with the symbols of his double nobility, the Inca blood and the Yaro blood. He was the living testimony that the pact of his ancestors had not been in vain, that his people had survived 2 world empires. Meanwhile, in the highlands of Huánuco, life continued with a silent tenacity. The towers of Rapayán and Garu, although partially abandoned or reused, remained standing. The Spaniards, busy searching for gold and converting souls, paid little attention to these dry stone structures in the cold heights. They had no buried gold, only history, and thus the towers became silent guardians of time. The local peasants continued cultivating the ancient terraces, using the same irrigation techniques that their Yaro ancestors had perfected. The dances of the Mamareguana continued to be danced in patron saint festivals, although Christian saints now occupied the place of honor in the processions. The culture had not died, it had camouflaged. It had learned to hide its essence under layers of new impositions, waiting for the appropriate moment to resurface. This resilience was the true legacy of the Yaros. It was not their capacity to kill in war, but their capacity to persist in peace, to adapt without losing their identity core. Yaro architecture continued inspiring subsequent generations. Even in colonial times, local builders looked with amazement at the ruins of the 5-story citadels. They wondered how men without iron tools had achieved such perfection. Legends grew around these sites. It was said that they were enchanted, that the spirits of the ancient warriors still patrolled the walls on full moon nights. The Spaniards tried to use the stones of these fortresses to build their own churches and mansions in the valleys. But they often encountered inexplicable difficulties, strange accidents as if the stone refused to be moved from its sacred place. Finally, they learned to leave the ruins in peace, accepting them as part of the inhospitable landscape of the Puna. Thus, the towers of Tantamayo were saved from total demolition, remaining as stone skeletons against the intense blue sky, mute witnesses of the history that developed at their feet. The military legacy of the Yaros also endured in the memory of the region. During the indigenous rebellions against the Spaniards in the following centuries, insurgent leaders often looked towards Huánuco for support. They knew that the people of that area had warrior blood, that they knew the terrain better than anyone. Although the great pagan army of the Vikings was a distant echo on another continent, the spirit of resistance of the Yaros had a parallel in their tenacity. They did not necessarily seek global conquest, but they defended their home with a ferocity that disconcerted the invaders. Geography was their ally, as it had been against the Incas. The mists, the cold, the altitude, everything worked in favor of the local defenders. The Spaniards learned, just like the Incas, that subduing the central highlands required more than weapons. It required patience and negotiation. And in those negotiations, the descendants of the Yarowilca were always present, remembering the ancient pacts, demanding respect for their people. Towards the end of his life, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala wrote his last words with a trembling but firm hand. He knew he would probably never be read by the king for whom he wrote, but that did not matter. What mattered was that the message existed. It mattered that someone in some future would find that book and know that the Yaros existed, that they were not just a footnote in the history of the Inca Empire, but a civilization with its own light, that they built skyscrapers when the world thought they were savages, that they fought against the sun and won a place at its side, that their rebellion was not chaos, but a search for dignity. The manuscript was guarded, lost, forgotten in a royal library in Denmark for centuries, far from the mountains that inspired it. But the word has a strange power. Eventually, the book was rediscovered, and when the pages were opened again, the voice of the Yaros resonated through time, crossing oceans and centuries to reach the present. Today, when the wind blows in the province of Yarowilca, it still carries that cold cut that the elders described. Tourists walk among the ruins of Garu, touching the stones with amazement, trying to imagine the life that once pulsed between those walls. They do not see the battles, nor the blood, nor the fear. They see the beauty of the architecture, the harmony with the landscape. But those who listen carefully can hear the echo of the Mama Reguana drums on clear nights. They can feel the presence of the architects who looked towards the sky and decided to build stone stairways to approach the gods. The history of the Yaros is a reminder that civilization is not measured only by the size of the armies, but by the capacity to leave an indelible mark on the world. They survived the Incas, they survived the Spaniards, and their legacy survives now in the historical consciousness of a country that begins to recognize its deep roots. The towers of Tantamayo are still there, 5 stories of stone that rise over the abyss. They no longer need defenses. There are no armies to fear. Their very existence is a declaration of victory. They won the most important battle, the battle against oblivion. While a single person stands beneath their walls and looks up with admiration, the Yaros remain alive. Their rebel and nonconformist spirit has transformed into cultural pride. The sacred plant, the Wilca, continues growing in the valleys, reminding the meaning of its name. And the blood of the Guaman Poma runs in the veins of thousands of Peruvians who walk the streets of Huánuco, of Lima, of the world, carrying unconsciously the memory of those warrior shepherds who dominated the heights. The cycle has closed, but the history continues. Each stone is a word, each ruin is a phrase, and the entire landscape is the open book of a civilization that refused to die. The wind continues blowing, cutting and cold, but it is no longer an enemy. It is the breath of the ancestors, watching from the summits, making sure that no one ever forgets who were the owners of these mountains before the world changed forever. The epic of the Yarowilca did not end with the conquest. It transformed into memory, and in memory they are immortal.